Perfect. All right. Okay, welcome everyone. As the attendees list starts to populate, I don't know if you are like me and got caught off guard by Australian daylight savings time, but I'm very glad that you're here. And let's kick things off. All right. So first things first, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus, UTS, in the city now stands. I would also like to pay respect to both elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I would further like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which all of our attendees are joining today, and to pay respect to those elders past and present. So if you're new or if you have been here before, well, you're familiar with the lecture series now, as I hope you are. This is now the fourth lecture in the series. We took a 1-week hiatus last week, and now we're continuing with the second half of the series. And I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Katja Knecht, who has been conducting research at the intersection of media architecture, computing, and urban planning for over 10 years in Germany, the UK, and Singapore. That's why you liked last week's lecture, because you worked in Singapore. Her primary research focus is the human and design-centered development of digital systems to support urban architectural design and planning processes. Dr. Katja is a postdoctoral researcher at Space Lab, which is a spatial analytics and cross-disciplinary experimentation lab at the Institute for Sustainable Urbanism at TU Braunschweig in Germany. I'm very excited for the lecture, and I've trained myself not to talk as much to introduce everyone so that you guys have more time. So Katja, thank you so much for joining and for kicking off the second half of the series, and I will transfer over to you.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you also very much for the invitation to present some of our institute's work here today. Let's see, I'm waiting for the, okay, now we
Perfect.
go.
I see it.
Yes, so the title of the lecture is Human-centric, knowledge-based planning and design for livable, sustainable urban futures. And my colleague was joking last week that this title could have come straight out of a buzzword generator, but I hope that after these 40-ish minutes, this all will make sense. And in the second half of the lecture, I will showcase one of our projects called Metropolis in a little bit more detail to illustrate how we think a human-centric, knowledge-based approach can support planning and design for livable, sustainable urban futures. But first, I would like to give a brief introduction to our institute and lab, and also give a brief overview of topics and methods we are also currently working on. So for those of you who don't know, the Institute for Sustainable Urbanism is based at the Technische Universität Braunschweig, an institute for technology in Germany. Braunschweig is situated in the northern part of Germany, about 2 hours away from Berlin. And our institute is led by Professor Vanessa Miriam Carlo. And this is the team. So the work I'll be presenting here today is their work. And our current team members come from a range of disciplines, ranging from architecture and urban planning, of course, to landscape architecture, computer science, social sciences, and media technology, such as myself. The Spatial Analytics and Cross-Disciplinary Experimentation Lab is, or in short, Space Lab, is a multidisciplinary competence center of urban research. And since last year, we've got new facilities in a new space, which you can see on the right, which is quite flexible and provides us with the space to conduct lectures, workshops, as well as, for example, VR experiments. At the core of our research stand tools and strategies for sustainable urbanism, and the approaches we pursue are data-driven, human-centric, and evidence-based. So our work spans actually from science to practice, and it's deeply anchored in research, but also in teaching. So we also do research-based teaching. And one important part of our work is also collaboration. We work together with practice partners such as municipalities, but also with a range of experts from other disciplines such as transportation planning, mechanical engineering, and also the social sciences. One topic we're interested in now, One topic we're interested in is understanding human perception of urban space. We've conducted experiments, for example, using eye tracking to understand how spatial configurations determine people's gaze, what aspects draw their attention in the urban realm, and which aspects they focus on. For example, this is a master thesis. We did a case study in different places in Braunschweig to understand how the human gaze and the depth and height of gazes, the focus attention of different zones varies in different urban contexts. For example, the student found that although the number of gazing points doesn't change in different environments, with a variety or with the complexity of the urban environment, also the aspects the participants looked at varied more. For example, they were also looking at balconies, front gardens, and other features. We also have recently begun to conduct virtual reality experiments in the new space we have now, which allows us to conduct more controlled experiments, also looking at similar topics, trying to understand human perception in the urban realm. So the more human-centric approaches we employ are complemented by also data-driven approaches. On larger scale, we look at, for example, the public transport accessibility of urban rural regions. This is an example from the region, the greater Braunschweig area, so the region around here. And it was based on data on public transport modalities, catchment areas, operating frequencies, and connectivity. So something we found was that around 60% of the area possesses a potential for densification, and that access to the public transport is in relation to population density either very good or good, but also that a significant amount of inhabitants have no or limited access to public transport. Also, we've employed deep learning and autoencoding methods to derive streetscape features from high-resolution satellite images and metadata. The aim here is to create a geospatial data set, which can then be used to generate 3D views and street cross-sections for the city. And so one of the challenges we face, and I think we're not alone in this, is the availability of data. Sometimes it's difficult to obtain data. Sometimes also the data we need is not there, simply not there. So one of the examples of this is information or data on human mobility in the city. And but if we want to design future mobility and more accessible future cities, we need to understand human mobility and the human mobility needs better. So we built a MIG app, the MIG app, an application that allows citizens to collect data about their movement and mobility patterns. It also allows them to share the data anonymously with researchers. So to make sure it's all according to data protection and privacy standards. A similar issue, and this is what we are currently working on, is noise. According to the European Noise Directive, cities need to regularly create noise maps as well as review and create new noise abatement plans. However, the maps are based on calculations. So what the situation is actually on the ground, we don't know, and it could be different. In a seminar last winter, we developed with students sensor kits that allow to collect urban data, and we're now planning to employ it also to collect noise data in the city. So this is a quick overview of some of the sustainability challenges we've addressed in the past in projects, which range from urban-rural relations and balances, and looked at small cities in Lower Saxony, in Germany, to addressing environmental issues that are faced in cities like New York and megacities in China. So the challenges we are confronted with in general are very diverse, and they range across different scales. They transcend administrative borders and also very often national borders, or in general national borders. Although the impacts we very often see seem to be very local. And also something we've seen with recent extreme weather events and flooding, something we also had in Germany last year. And to address these diverse sets of challenges, also a diverse set of tools and methods are needed. I will now come to the Metropolis project, the project I want to focus on a little bit more in depth. So this will show how we combine data-driven, knowledge-based, and human-centric approaches in the scope of a project looking at sustainable development. But first, I'm gonna take a step back, because one of the global challenges we face is urbanization, and you've seen the slides, I'm sure, a lot of times before in various ways. But what I would like to point out is that urbanization is different can be different in different regions. So the increase in urban population that's expected is expected to happen, for like 90% of the growth is actually expected to happen in Asia and Africa. So in countries like Germany, which are already highly urbanized, the expected urbanization rate is going to be rather slow. And some of the, apart from the natural increase in population, other sources of urban growth are migration and the reclassification of neighboring of very rural settlements. So, and depending on where we are in the world and in which country, in which region, one or the other of the factors can be important. Also, only a fraction of the urban population lives in so-called megacities, urban agglomerations of more than 10 million inhabitants. And close to half of the urban population still lives in settlements with less than 500,000 inhabitants. However, as the urban population grows, also the size of cities will grow, also across the board. And what you can see on the right is that the population distribution is also, or varies also according to the regions and also different countries. So when we now look at Germany, as I said, Germany is already highly urbanized. So 3 out of 4 people already live in urban areas, but the majority of these actually live in urban settlements with less than 300,000 people. This means in Germany, cities are rather small, and also the boundaries of what is urban, what is rural are rather transient. Here, the reclassification and land grab drive urbanization and also pose a challenge to the sustainable future development of urban and rural areas. So this is one of the challenges we addressed in the Metropolis project, which ran from 2016 to 2021. It was an interdisciplinary research project that focused in particular on the urban relations here in Lower Saxony in Germany and offered strategies for sustainable development of these areas. Another motivation for the project was that contemporary planning approaches here in Germany revolve around administrative boundaries, which you can see on the image in the left. So, but due to the historical growth of cities, in reality, we have to deal with a combination of different settlement units, which have different structures, different characteristics, and also therefore different planning needs. To deal with this, we developed the Topoi method, which is a method that allows to identify, map, characterize, and classify these territorial settlement structures, as well as also the interlinkages between settlements. And this method then was applied in the 2 case study regions that you can see on the right in the scope of the Metropolis project. The ensuing analysis shows that the urban-rural gradient can be described with this method in much greater detail than a classical distinction. Those are the white borders are the administrative boundaries. So then this classical distinction between the country and the city and the county allows, and also reveals a very heterogeneous pattern of settlements across the region. The method itself, now it takes a, The method itself consists of several steps. So first, the form of the settlements is created using the proximity of buildings to identify settlements of at least 8 buildings within a radius of a maximum of 40 meters of each other. And next, for these settlements, 11 planning indicators are calculated. And these include parameters of form, such as area and compactness, parameters of function, looking, for example, functional variety and population density, and also parameters of spatial linkages, such as settlement density and public transportation connectivity. In the final step, then, affinity propagation is run on the dataset, which identifies different classes of topoi or the settlement types that possess similar characteristics. For the 2 study regions in Lower Saxony, we derived 13 topoi classes of settlements that possess similar characteristics, and their location in space and the connection between them allows to differentiate between urban and rural characteristic categories, such as nodes, which are urban cores, peri-urban categories, such as urban that are situated at the urban fringe, disseminated categories, which feature like very diverse patterns, and the exo classes, which are rather isolated patterns. And this, as I mentioned previously, shows that the urban-rural gradient can take very different forms and is also very diverse. Based on these topoi, we call them topoi classes, we can define prototypes, which can serve as a basis for the development of scenarios to explore and devise strategies for their sustainable future development. So, and as these prototypes can be considered prototypical for the settlement type, these strategies can then be applied to all settlements of a specific type, and thus we can derive some information also on a larger planning scale and evaluate the impact of certain planning measures as a whole. So by focusing on one, we can improve many. That's our hypothesis. In the scope of the project, we worked on 3 case studies. We chose 3 specific topoi classes and 3 specific examples of these topoi classes. Eidelstedt, which belongs to the topoi class disseminated hamlet, Detmarode, an exo-satellite town, and Shoppingstedt, a peri-urban village. I will be explaining the next steps we took in this project based on Shoppingstedt, the peri-urban village, as an example. So after the identification of these different settlement units and types, we ran actually scenario planning workshops with the municipalities involved. So in these planning workshops, representatives from the municipalities as well as scientists and experts work together to develop scenarios in a series of workshops and discussed were drivers, challenges, risks, opportunities, and also uncertainties for future development. The resulting scenarios and also the development potentials and suggestions were then again discussed with the municipalities, but also with the general public. So 4 scenarios were developed in total. They are characterized by different levels of governance. Some are more non-regulatory, some are more regulatory. Also by different lifestyles. Sometimes the lifestyle is more sustainable, sometimes it's closer to the status quo. So scenario A, green communities, features a collaborative approach of living and working in dense settlement structures. Scenario B, planned happy future, has a focus on efficient land use and the use of land as a resource, as well as the strengthening of rural and suburban spaces. Scenario C, new settlers, demonstrates how spatial expansion can be steered in a more sustainable way. And scenario D, communities repurposed, addresses spatial and functional transformations due to areas that are abandoned or need to be redeveloped. So although the scenarios were equal for all 3 case study areas in respect to the drivers and also the uncertainties, they also followed a certain development logic. The way they were developed then spatially was different for the different municipalities, which you can see here. So based on the analysis of the case study areas, the development potentials for the areas and also visions were developed. And now I'll explain this on based on Shoppingstedt as an example. So Shoppingstedt is a peri-urban village in the east of Lower Saxony. Peri-urban villages are in general located at the urban fringes, so they are smaller than what we call peri-urban towns. They still have a medium to high functional diversity, a relatively high ratio of retail spaces, and a medium population density. Although they are the least compact compared to other village types, a special characteristic is that they are located close to or also possess their own regional train station and have therefore also relatively high accessibility. In the whole of the study areas that we looked at in Lower Saxony, we found 42 settlement units of the peri-urban type, and with a total of 209,000 residents. So Shoppingstedt has has a population of 5,000 inhabitants, and although it's called a village, it's already a rather small town. It has a traditional center with a market square and a town hall with a bank, shops, and restaurants. Actually, you can see it on the top here. And the area around the train station, which is in the south of the town, forms a second center and has several supermarkets there. Furthermore, there are businesses which are scattered across the town, and there's a small industrial area located in the western part. The settlement unit, like other peri-urban villages, shows a strong increase in housing-related land take since the 1970s. So, and a lot of this new building stock consists of single-family houses, which you can see on the center right image. So it means the settlements have a high building density, but a low compactness, which provides potential for densification. So under the 4 scenarios, different development potentials and possible interventions were identified for Shoppingstedt. Here you can see the vision for Shoppingstedt under scenario D, which is called Shoppingstedt repurposed. And scenario D means that previously set environmental and energy targets were not attained. So fossil fuels are not completely phased out in that scenario. And most of the emissions stem from unsustainable practices in manufacturing, but technological advancements allowed the region to maintain its competitive advantage in this scenario. Due to the specifics of the scenario, also public transport stops were removed and were replaced by options provided by the introduction of autonomous vehicles. As mentioned briefly before, one of the foci of this scenario D, is the transformation of areas with obsolete functions and abandoned buildings, in this case into productive premises. So the purpose conversion also questions the nature of production and the impact of digitalization and automation on small towns and villages of the future. the development of the scenario didn't stop at the identification of potentials for development, or remained on a planning level, but also developed concrete urban design solutions for Shoppingstedt. In the specific scenario, for example, new housing estates were developed with modern types of detached houses that function either as self-sufficient units or as productive neighborhoods. So we imagined that hybrid mixed-use buildings would offer a lot of space for new forms of urban production, also for urban farming, as well as for living and also the provision of energy. Autonomous vehicles are replacing the numerous trucks that are usually driving in the area, and change the street spaces into a more livable place for all. The scenarios were, as I mentioned, also discussed with representatives of the municipalities, and some of which took some of the proposed interventions actually up. So in general, the scenarios were well received, in particular as a base for discussion, also as a base for communication engagement with citizens to openly discuss possible future developments, and also how the community wanted to live together in the future. They were seen also as new pathways next to classic planning procedures, or even as providing guidelines or motivation to work towards changes and towards more sustainable practices. So based on the goal I mentioned before, that we can improve many by focusing on one, we also scaled the impacts of the interventions and proposed urban design propositions up from a local to a regional scale. So for this, we calculated the impact on a local scale, and then extrapolated it to the regional scale. For example, if the interventions of scenario D were applied to all 42 peri-urban villages in the study region, housing for around 50,000 additional residents could be realized. This corresponds to a population increase of 23.8%. In comparison to the status quo, so the population that resides there today, and this with a relatively low additional consumption of land by applying the housing typologies that I showed earlier. So this approach allows to evaluate which measures have which impact locally, but then also on a rather bigger scale. Yeah, so the Metropolis project was recently published in a book. So if you want to get to know more and have a look at the other scenarios, feel free to have a look at our publication. It's available in online stores now. And another publication that's come out of the project is the Urban Rural Intervention Catalog. So the interventions that were proposed for the 4 scenarios and 3 Topoi classes that we picked have been collected and published in this catalog, which is available online on our website, spacelab.ezu.org. And it's also open for contributions. So if there are any additional interventions you can think of, feel free to add them to our catalog. The methods that we developed and also applied in the scope of the Metropolis project are actually transferable and also have been transferred in the scope of another project called East Cities, establishing and achieving sustainability targets in Eastern Chinese cities. So they don't only work for the urban-rural gradient, but also in the scope of the development of larger cities with up to 10 million inhabitants. The example here was in Qingdao, our partner city, and so the 9 Topoi classes that we identified there, you can see on the right. So to conclude, we strongly believe that human-centric knowledge-based approaches are a good way forward for the planning and design for livable, sustainable urban futures. So the Metropolis project that I've discussed is one example of how such an approach could look like, but it's also something we continue to work on. And we're also in particular looking at how to integrate some of the other methods and tools that I've shown in the beginning into such a sustainable development approach. One of the challenges next to the availability of data that I've already mentioned before is also always the transfer into practice, which is something we are trying to address by collaborating with partners such as the municipalities in the Metropolis project. And it's also something we are trying to continue to do in the future. And yeah, so I hope I'm actually already at the end of my lecture. I was quicker in this now than during my trial run. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. So there's more time now for questions, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Katja. That was absolutely great. And some really beautiful graphics, to be honest. And I really appreciate the time that you went through walking us through this. It's an astounding body of work. And I must admit, like the various metrics, the depth in which you go into not only proposing intervention strategies, but even assessing the current status is actually quite fascinating. The first question I had, and then I'll open up to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please shoot them in the Q&A section. At the beginning, you mentioned that the team at Space Lab is a highly interdisciplinary team from different backgrounds. And a common theme that I have noticed come up in this lecture series, but also similar lecture series, is how important that is, that it's not necessarily just an architect or an urban designer that is needed for these decisions. It's actually a highly interdisciplinary team that is scientific based, but also quite theoretical based. Can you expand on that? Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that, whether beneficial, were there any challenges with having an interdisciplinary team in terms of finding common ground, perhaps either in language or in agreement on specific topics? I think we would all benefit a lot from that.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. And I was actually that's probably one of the first things I would have mentioned. Finding a common ground is indeed a challenge. And also we're not only interdisciplinary, have a lot, like only a lot of disciplines, so we come from a range of disciplines. We also come from very different parts of the world. So we also have a very international team. So obviously the first challenge you face is finding a common ground. But as you continue to work together, this gets easier over time, and the benefits of interdisciplinary teams and also work are really huge, because you don't you have different perspectives within the project, so different angles you can pursue and look, take to look at a certain problem or question. And I don't know, personally think it's kind of triangulation, like having a mixed methods approach to research by having different disciplines join a team. And it means that the results you get are much richer, I'd say, because you can look at the problem at hand from different perspectives and also identify questions, solutions, actually on all levels, things that you wouldn't have found if you'd only looked at it from your own angle. I'm thinking of an example, but
I wonder if a specific discipline you felt that is not yours was quite influential on your work.
So I've worked in, I myself have an interdisciplinary background, so it's difficult to say. So it's part of me in a way, but I always feel like, or for example, I attended a lecture a couple of months ago from economics. It's something I'm not familiar with at all, to be honest, but I was intrigued by the question they were discussing, and I realized it's very similar to something we wanted to look at. It was also about scenarios for the future, if I remember correctly. And then looking at how they approached it was very interesting because, it's probably something I take from, or I'm interested in learning from other disciplines, are the methods they use to approach certain questions and learn from this. Because, in general, methods are important. So extending your tool set is always beneficial. But
Fantastic.
It doesn't mean that you have to learn it all by yourself, but just getting a glimpse and understanding what it's about, and then trying to collaborate with someone who knows these tools by trade makes a lot of sense.
Agreed completely. It reminds me of a quote by Darcy Thompson. If anyone's familiar, so he's this, of course, super famous mathematician. He wrote a book called On Growth and Form in the early 20s. And he said that creativity is only found at the intersection between the disciplines. And if you stick within your own discipline, all you will ever be is an expert to some other expert, which I found such a fascinating quote, because there's always going to be someone even more expert at your own discipline, but that creativity lies between disciplines, which is super fascinating. Okay, questions are coming in. Let me bring it off. So the first question is, were you able to integrate or assess CO2 emissions within this study that you presented today? Or how can you integrate specific environmental conditions that go beyond just the urban? They are one and the same.
Yes, I mean, you can always include indicators like this. So I think in this, if I remember correctly, but I might be wrong because I wasn't involved in the project, I'm not sure we calculated CO2 emissions in this specific project. But obviously it could be included as an indicator to evaluate the scenarios and also the interventions we propose. so I now come to think of it, it should have been there. So maybe I just didn't read it. Yeah, it's obviously an important measure or like an indicator to include.
I mean, what's also quite clear is that the system that is set up is very easily adaptable to include additional metrics, being CO2, solar, whatever kind of carbon footprint, whatever it is. I think it's that's quite unique and fascinating.
Yeah. I'm sorry, maybe to mention. I mean, it depends on basically the metrics you're interested in or are important and specific in the planning. From the planning perspective, these obviously you can include also then to decide on which interventions to focus on and take on for development, obviously.
Manisha's asking, first of all, thanks you immensely for a fantastic presentation. How long was the study, and were there any intermediate milestones based on which developmental decisions could be taken? And then the second part of that question is, what are the next steps that the study is looking into?
So the project itself went for 5 years, so it was funded for 5 years from 2016 to 21. I don't have the exact timeline in mind what the intermediate milestones were, but the order in which I presented was the order in which it was developed, because based on the different Topoi classes, the case study areas were selected. And
next steps.
And then the next steps. So, development decisions. So the research project is completed. The last step was the publication of the book. And it's a method that can be applied again in another context and in another project, but right now I'm not sure it is by now or it's coming up. So yeah, the study itself is the one I presented is completed, basically.
Cool. Liam, hello, Liam. Liam is actually, me and Liam recently wrote a paper that is currently under review about inhabiting skyways. And when you were talking about adding to the catalog, I was like, all right, perfect. We have something to add to the catalog for sure. So Liam's asking whether gathering data always appears to be a major hurdle. And Katja, like in Australia, it's 10 times that hurdle. So it's quite difficult. Do you find that the MIC app is successfully bridging the gap that you were hoping it would? And has it been adopted as much as you would have liked?
So, I mean, the app itself, I think, is a good first step to collecting data, also of including citizens in the collection of data. And basically, they still own the rights to their information, the data they collect, but they can share it as well. So, in general, we think this is a good way forward. However, the next question that regarding the adoption, obviously, not as many people as we'd like have adopted it yet. So it's something that's probably needs to be pushed more, or also maybe there needs to be a change in the awareness or mindset of people that also looking towards open data policies and that people contribute more as part of the Smart City, Open City initiative. But
yeah, I mean, the more I think about this, the more I feel that perhaps well, I don't want to say the best strategy, but historically a very good strategy that seemed to work is by collecting data through selling an alternative product, such as Instagram, Twitter, and all that. We were talking about this before the lecture began. So, which is fascinating because I mean, I remember 5, 6, 10 years ago, maybe, like you could access Twitter's data. It was all open source. You could track a human's movement from point A to point B based on what they were tweeting. And then they locked it down. And I mean, it makes you question, is that platform more about, you know, social engagement, or is it more about just collecting data in the background while in the front is social engagement, right? But of course, I love your approach, which is, no, look, we're going to collect data. Here's what we're doing. We're not going to sell you this other shiny keychain while we do something in the background. And I think, as you mentioned, I think it's just a matter of convincing the community that if we really want to improve our urban fabric, we need to engage with it, similar to how we engage with it in kind of community meetings and so on and so forth. This is just another form of engagement. And I'm assuming that if you are successful, you'll probably be very rich because you'll probably be the first people to do it. Such as a difficult thing it is to do. I just noticed that perhaps a colleague of yours, Olaf, has just uploaded some NDPI journal papers on global warming. So Manisha, if you're watching this or reading this, please have a look at those if you want to learn more. All right. I think we'll probably end with this question. Mainly because I know, Katja, that you're probably starting your workday soon in Germany. So Adrian is asking, for assessing intervention strategy locations, was it primarily identified via your analytical tools during the first part of the talk, or the workshops performed to the public, and how did that affect the process?
Okay, so the intervention strategies were, for one thing, based on the, not on necessarily, like, it refers to the first part of the lecture, but also on the general analysis we performed on the case study areas, which I showed briefly as well. So a very classic, partly a very classic urban planning design approach. You analyze the case study area, and then in respect also to the scenarios, because the different scenarios had different already different key drivers, and for a development, some like I don't know, like for example, in the case I showed, public transport was not there anymore, so that was determined by the or public transport was substituted by autonomous vehicles. So that was something that was given by the scenario itself. So it already meant there had to be an intervention. So so some of these were directly derived also from the scenarios, and or determined by the scenarios, and in combination with an analysis of the case study area. But obviously also some of the tools I showed, like accessibility analysis and others, which I didn't show, also were involved. Like accessibility analysis was in general also done on the case study areas. It was also one of the indicators that helped define the Topoi classes. So yeah, so the short answer is
both.
Both, yeah. Exactly.
Agreed.
So
I agree.
It's yeah.
No, that's perfect. And we've received a lot of questions on whether this lecture is recorded. It is recorded, thankfully, for Katja and her team. They gave us permission to record this and to share the recording, which we are super, super grateful. Adrian's saying much thanks already. So we really hope everyone enjoyed the lecture. Katja, really, once again, this was such a fantastic lecture, such to the point, beautifully presented, such a tremendous body of work, to be honest, that I think has massive impacts if my students are here, which they are, please be mindful of them, of the way in which the urban analysis was presented, because this is something that has been done to such a beautiful level. So really, Katja, thank you very much to you and your team, and to the Institute for sharing your work with us. And to everyone else, please join us in the coming 2 lectures in the coming 2 weeks. Thanks again, Katja.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, and thanks to everyone who joined today. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. All right. Have a nice night, everyone, and have a nice morning, Katja, and see you all next week. Goodbye.
Bye.